Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, John Kromer, author of Philadelphia Battlefields.
John Kromer is the author of Philadelphia Battlefields, Disruptive Campaigns and Upset Elections in a Changing City. Why did you write this book?
Well, I've spent a lot of time as a volunteer in civic associations and neighborhood organizations. In addition, during the 1980s, I was elected as a Democratic committee person in my ward in West Philadelphia. And it surprised me, and surprises me still, the many people that are very active with community groups and neighborhood associations and nonprofit service organizations steer clear of politics and frequently will say, I just don't want to get into that. It just doesn't seem like a good thing for me to do, or, it seems dirty, or there's something wrong with it. And, well, to some extent, that's true sometimes. But the political organizations in every city, not just Philadelphia, but in every city, really generate the leaders of tomorrow. So it just concerned me and made me curious about why people who are otherwise concerned about the well-being of society frequently don't get involved in influencing how this infrastructure is working. So I thought one way to examine that was to look at upset elections in the city of Philadelphia, which is known as a one-party town. Democrats have been in charge of Philadelphia basically since the 1950s. And so the basic understanding is a candidate endorsed by the Democratic Party is probably going to win. Just because there's no Republican Party strength to speak of. Currently, Democratic voters outnumber Republicans by a 7-1 margin. So the party has considerable strength. However, every now and then, and this is not a rare thing, a candidate who has not been endorsed by the Democratic Party will win, and not just win, but win spectacularly against another candidate who's an incumbent or has been strongly supported by the party leadership. So I thought it'd be worthwhile just to look into how that happens. Is it like the lottery? Well, I was just lucky. I happened to win this year. That's not the case ordinarily. Did somebody get paid off? Some political kingpin get paid? That's really not the case either. And what I found was very encouraging. What these upset elections have in common is that the insurgent candidate, the challenger, found a way to communicate honestly and effectively with voters about issues that they cared about. And I think one example in Philadelphia was the election for a new city controller that happened in 2017, in which Rebecca Rhynhart, a woman who had a public sector background but never run for elected office before, defeated Alan Buckovitz, who had been a state representative for quite some time, and then was the incumbent city controller and a ward leader. Nearly all the ward leaders supported him. Many of the ward leaders had no idea who she was, but she won spectacularly. She won in almost every area of the city. And so I thought it would be interesting to look into the reasons why upset elections like that happened. And I was fortunate in having an opportunity to speak directly with people who had been involved in those campaigns and to find out more about their secrets and how these things worked. As you know, in every city in Pennsylvania, there's a comparable political infrastructure. In home rule cities particularly, there's a mayor and a city council and a number of the city council members are elected by district, by a certain geographic area. And within those geographic areas, there are subdivisions, sometimes called precincts, sometimes called divisions, in which party elected officials who are unpaid work to get out the vote and to promote candidates. So although the book is about Philadelphia, it really is applicable, I think, to other cities, whether the Democrats or the Republicans are the dominant party in control, to examine this neighborhood-scale political infrastructure, learn how it works, and to look at opportunities to build up from the grassroots to support the election of capable candidates who might represent a new generation of leadership.
Now, you mentioned that you had been a committee person at one point. What is a committee person, and why did you decide to run for that office?
Well, it's very interesting. And again, there are counterparts to this in other Philadelphia cities. The city is divided up into small sections called divisions, and each division consists of roughly 1,000 registered voters, plus or minus. So as you can imagine, there are more than 1,000 divisions across the city. And also, they're very manageable. In some row house neighborhoods, one division consists of a few blocks that you could walk in a couple of hours. And 2 committee people are elected from each party for each division. And those 2 committee people work with the party organization to get people registered to vote, to communicate with voters about upcoming elections and candidates in those elections, and to help get out the vote on election day. And as I said, I've been involved with neighborhood organizations, and it seemed to me that getting into the election infrastructure and learning how to promote more involvement in voting and elections and a more knowledgeable electorate would be a good thing. And so what I found after being elected committee person was counterparts in other divisions in this ward. And what really surprised me was that these other committee people really represented the community very effectively in terms of age, level of education, racial and ethnic diversity. They were really much more representative of the community than, your average neighborhood organization or nonprofit organization. And many of them were involved in their congregation of faith. Some were involved with government agencies, and many of them were very committed to working together to advance democracy, in effect. Needless to say, there are a lot of other people in the political infrastructure, and this is not only true in Philadelphia, who are not that interested in promoting democracy and are more interested in getting out a controlled vote. In some cases, not encouraging people to participate in elections so that voters who will always vote for the endorsed candidate will produce the majority for a party-favored candidate. So the structure of the party organization in Philadelphia, and again, I believe this is true elsewhere in Pennsylvania, is very consistent with democracy and representative government. The party elects people from the grassroots. They get together and elect a party leadership. What could be more democratic than that? And my conclusion really has been that there isn't a fatal problem with the structure of the party organization. The problem is with the people who are in charge of the organization. And that's not to say, we should throw out everybody and elect some elite group, people like me, to take control and run the place. Some very capable, qualified people, many of them are already working in the organization, the grassroots. But the leadership really, to a considerable extent, is kind of fossilized. And you have people that have been in the same positions for decades. And this hasn't always been conducive to the well-being of the voters at large. So finding a way to change that by getting more people involved and to get by getting more people to participate at the grassroots level, I think is really important going forward. I think it's important to bear in mind that whether you like them or not, the people who are now sitting under the dome of the state capitol in Harrisburg and the Capitol in Washington, D.C., many of them got their start at the grassroots level. They got elected as, auditor or controller or a district council person, and worked their way up through the party structure and through elections for higher office, and became some of the leaders of the Commonwealth or of the nation. And so to the extent that people are concerned one way or another about what's going on in Harrisburg and what's going on in D.C., regardless of what party you belong to, and I expect the voters in both parties are concerned for various reasons, this is really the opportunity to help advance a new generation of leadership. People who are younger, who have not bought into any particular ideology, people who care about issues at the neighborhood level and at the city and county level, and really get them more engaged in politics and in governance. And I think that could be a very good thing.
Now, one of the figures that you mentioned previously that you feature in the book was Rebecca Rhynhart. She ran for city controller in 2017. You said that was not an ordinary year. Why?
There was a reaction to the presidential election of 2016 on the part of voters that were concerned about the election of Donald Trump, and one group that mobilized in response to this concern consisted of women who decided to run for office. And this sort of movement took place in some areas of Pennsylvania, but also nationally, both in urban and rural areas. Clearly, there were Trump supporters as well, but at this particular time, the sort of anti-Trump movement really gained some traction, and one outcome of that was the results of the midterm elections, in which a significant number of women were elected to seats in Congress. To a certain extent, that was reflected at a local level in Philadelphia and in other cities. And 2017 was the first election after the presidential election in which people who felt that, I'm concerned about this, I have to do something, had an opportunity to do something, and that was to run for office at the local level. And Rebecca Rhynhart was a person who had a strong private sector background. She was not a traditional politician. Alan Butkovich really was an outstanding state representative and a very well-qualified controller. So it's not like he was some political hack, but he was very attached to the party organization. And I think that sort of characteristic of his was widely known. And there may have been a feeling on the part of many voters that it was time for a change. And here was a well-qualified professional person who happened to be a woman who might be a good person to replace Alan Butkovich in the 2017 elections.
So when a candidate like Rhynhart decides to take on a candidate who's endorsed by the city party organization, what is she up against?
Well, the DA election, which takes place in a so-called off year in which there's no presidential election, in which the governor's office is not going to be on the ballot, is a tough election to run in because the voter turnout is going to be much lower than it is in the presidential election or a mayoral election. And that means that the controlled voters, the voters that will consistently come to the polls and consistently vote for the party-endorsed candidates, are going to be a big, big factor. And so what Rhynhart and her campaign organization did really was not to follow the traditional path and go to ward meetings and ask the ward leaders for their support. They weren't going to support her. For the most part, they were well acquainted with Alan Butkovich, who was a ward leader himself, and just reflexively would support him. Rhynhart had an interesting opportunity because the other race, the top of the ballot, was the district attorney's race. And the previous district attorney, Seth Williams, had resigned in disgrace. after some being the subject of a criminal investigation. And so there was a lot of interest in the DA's race and in finding a capable person to run for district attorney. And there were half a dozen candidates, several of them very well qualified. Representative Butkovitz supported one of the candidates who was who had an affiliation with the labor unions, because I think he felt that labor had supported him, and so he should side with the labor-endorsed candidate. That really created an opportunity for Rebecca Rhynhart, because she could go to the other 5 DA candidates and say, Butkovitz supported your opponent. And so rather than visiting these ward meetings, which would end without her being endorsed, she went to the DA candidates and said, would you put me on your sample ballot as your endorsed candidate for controller? And the sample ballots, as you probably know, are handed out by poll workers, activists at the polling places at each election day. And they show the ballot and show recommended candidates. So the DA candidates, by and large, weren't that involved in the city control election. And so most of them, I think, felt this would be fine. Why not do it? And the result was a lot of people who are aggressively supporting DA candidates were also supporting Rhynhart.
So is there a playbook for insurgent candidates, or are they just kind of figuring things out on their own?
Well, what I found out was that there are 3 sort of elements to an upset campaign that contributed to successes in the cases I looked at. One was having a clear identity as a candidate. It's not enough just to be a great person, to be an angel. There has to be something that sets you apart from your competitor. And I think in the case of Rhynhart, as I said, she had a financial industry background. She had worked for the city and worked on budgeting. She was clearly a qualified professional. And what was as important, I think, was that she didn't have a political background. She hadn't run for office before. City controllers in the past, and this is not just true in Philadelphia, some of them have a tendency to want to call a press conference whenever they feel there's an opportunity to do so. And that was certainly the case with Butkovitz, and I think it conveyed the impression among many voters that this was somebody who was a little political, and that Rhynhart would be more focused on getting the job done. A second sort of element of a successful insurgent campaign is voter education, particularly in a so-called off-year election, giving voters an understanding of, why should I care? Why should I care about this particular candidate and show up at the polls at this election? Philadelphia and other cities that have an industrial background have been struggling with budget issues and with funding the schools and funding city services. And so to have a candidate who was talking about being focused on those issues, being focused on the books, challenging the mayor and city council when she felt that the budget wasn't being managed in the appropriate way, or where there were opportunities to innovate and improve, really set her apart. And that was what was needed. And the third element is the party. What is the Democratic Party going to do? Are they going to aggressively support one of the candidates, or are they going to make this election a so-called open election in which the party organization doesn't endorse any particular candidate? The DA election in Philadelphia was an open election. The party organization, the city committee, wasn't supporting any one of the candidates. They were supporting Alan Butkovitz, but the fact that the DA race was open provided an opportunity for Rhynhart to make alliances with the DA candidates and, in effect, be on their teams, all of them at once, to produce the votes that were needed. So those were common features that I found in all of the elections. But what was encouraging to me was that the key was communicating with voters about issues that they cared about. Again, it wasn't enough to say, I'm the reform candidate, I'm a good person. You had to have a message that really connected with voters with respect to issues that were of concern to them. And many voters have been and are concerned about education, funding for schools, funding for police and fire protection, funding for basic services. And so this connected very effectively in that particular election.
Now, Ed Rendell would serve as Pennsylvania governor and Philadelphia mayor, but he started off challenging an incumbent for the district attorney race. Can you talk about his experiences there? You say that the Democratic City Committee, that their strategy for dealing with Rendell was to ignore him.
Yeah, something very interesting happened in 1977. Ed Rendell was much skinnier then, if you can see the picture there. But he worked in the DA's office when Arlen Specter was district attorney. Specter was upset by a Democratic candidate, Emmett Fitzpatrick, during a period in which Frank Rizzo really was coming to dominate the Philadelphia scene and to take control of the Democratic Party in Philadelphia. And so in the 1977 district attorney's race, the party endorsed Fitzpatrick. None of the ward leaders, with I think one or two exceptions, cared about Ed Rendell, who had no political background. Again, he had worked for the district attorney's office, but he was a newcomer. The opportunity for Rendell really consisted of two parts. One was that nearly everyone was sure that Emmett Fitzpatrick would win. And then secondly, interestingly, almost everybody disliked Emmett Fitzpatrick for various reasons. He had kind of a checkered past. He had been a defense attorney, and in some cases he had a way of presenting himself that turned people off. More importantly, he had refused to testify in a grand jury proceeding in which a mob leader had been accused of taking a payoff, and Fitzpatrick's testimony appeared to be needed, and his refusal to participate raised some questions about him. But what really took the cake was news coverage of a trip that Fitzpatrick made to a district attorney conference in Canada, at which he invoiced the city for reimbursement for what he described as a dinner with other prosecutors at what he called a restaurant called Aquascutum. And he represented this in his invoicing as a seafood restaurant. But after a little investigation, the press found out that it was really a men's clothing store, and the invoice was for a safari suit that Fitzpatrick bought for himself. And I think this is a time when Nehru jackets were being worn by some people. I'm not sure what a safari suit is. I think it has these flaps over the chest and maybe these things on the shoulders. But clearly this was far from a legitimate expense. And this incident generated even more unfavorable publicity. So Rendell had an interesting strategy as he described it. All he had to do was convince people that he was on the ballot. He was an alternative to Fitzpatrick. And so, again, where he had an opportunity to go to ward meetings and present himself, he would do that. Most of the ward leaders would not let him in. And to a large extent, he spent time at train stations, commuter train stations, at bus stops. In the evening, he would visit, diners and bars. He was not and is not a drinker, but he's someone who can strike up a conversation with anyone. That's the way he's always been. And he's an avid sports fan. So coming into a neighborhood tap room and striking up a conversation with somebody about the Phillies was something he was capable of doing. And the next day, that person would say, hey, there's this guy running for DA who showed up at the bar last night, and we had this discussion. He would do this morning and evening, week in, week out, roughly between January and the mid-May election, just to make those communications happen. So that was a big plus. In addition, he looked for sort of cracks in the Democratic Party infrastructure. After committee people are elected, and now they're elected every 4 years, about 2 weeks later, the committee people in a particular ward get together and elect a ward leader. In Philadelphia, there are 66 wards, and some of the ward boundaries are consistent with neighborhood boundaries. Others are not. But in any case, the elected committee people, and there may be a dozen of them, there may be 4 dozen of them, get together and elect one of their number to be the ward leader. And sometimes those elections are contentious, and sometimes there is opposition and division among the committee people. So Rendell looked for those ward leader elections in which the losing candidate had support of a lot of the committee people. And he went to the committee people who had supported the loser and invited them to support his campaign. Because the winner in the ward election was going to support Fitzpatrick. And those individuals who had supported the losing candidate at the ward level might feel that there was an opportunity to shake things up in a party organization that they felt didn't represent their interests perfectly. So as Rendell put it, in some polling places, there might be committee people who would be handing out a sample ballot that was called the official Democratic ballot. And other people at other polling places might be handing out a flyer that at the top of the ballot said the new Democratic Party ballot. And that really resonated with voters. And this election took place a year after the defeat of a recall effort to recall Frank Rizzo from office. Recall elections were provided for in the Philadelphia City Charter, and the provision called for petitions to be circulated and signed by a certain number of voters, many voters in the city, in order to have a referendum question placed on the ballot, which in this case would be the question of should Frank Rizzo be recalled from office as mayor of Philadelphia. And at this time, there was a lot of opposition to Rizzo, lots of support for him as well, but there was really a groundswell of opposition to him. This case, needless to say, went into litigation after the supporters of the referendum acquired the appropriate number of signatures. And at the Pennsylvania Supreme Court level, the referendum was rejected as unconstitutional, even though it had been called for in the city charter. And as I understand it, the Supreme Court's decision was based on a feeling that the state constitution didn't allow it. I think some people would feel that was debatable, but the outcome of that was you had a couple of 100,000 people who had signed their names and addresses onto these recall petitions. And the assumption was these were people that a year later might be interested in voting for the district attorney candidate who opposed Rizzo's choice for DA, Emmett Fitzpatrick. So the combination of the unhappiness with the recall referendum and the negative feelings about Fitzpatrick, combined with Ed Rendell's energetic traveling across the city to introduce himself to voters, really was enough to produce a win. And it was not a close race. The sort of feeling among the political experts, and this was published by the columnists and news reporters who were covering politics in the major newspapers, the feeling was this is a controlled election. Rendell is not going to win. The party organization is going to do what it usually does so well, turn out the voters, for the party-endorsed candidate, Fitzpatrick. Well, that didn't happen. Rendell won, and won big in almost every area of the city. So it's a fascinating thing. Needless to say, incumbent candidates who are not well regarded frequently win re-election, and that's a real shame that happens. But that does happen too. And in this instance, there was just the right combination of factors that made it possible for Rendell to win. And in terms of the three elements that I described earlier, he identified himself as the alternative to Fitzpatrick, and that was all that mattered to many people. But I think what also mattered was the fact that he had a reputation as a prosecutor. He'd been head of the DA's homicide unit at a time when people were increasingly concerned about crime in Philadelphia, and that, I think, was felt to be a plus by many of them. And the third issue, the Democratic Party, in this situation, the party members, like the press and others, just assumed Fitzpatrick would win. So there was not a big party effort to go after Rendell and to go negative on Rendell. People largely felt, as the news writers felt, that Fitzpatrick would be a shoo-in and that Rendell was not going to be a problem. Well, what a surprise.
Well, voter turnout is always something that is a major concern. And in your book, you break down voters into three categories. And you've used the term a few times already, controlled voters. And you also talk about inspired voters and undecided voters. Can you break each of those down?
Sure, and I think people who come to the polls on Election Day will recognize this. There are people who have strong feelings about the Democratic Party organization, or in other cities like Altoona, where I've spent a lot of time and have been told that everybody's a Republican so that the Republicans don't have Democrats to fight and they fight each other. But regardless of the party, there's some people that are lifelong members of the party, and they just go to the polls and vote for the party just because they feel this allegiance to the party, and to some extent don't feel the need, particularly with regard to the down ballot races, to consider alternatives. They just feel that the party organization should be supported consistently. So those are the what I term the controlled voters. There's another category of voters that are very enthusiastic about a candidate or about a particular issue that candidate represents. Think about Donald Trump, for example. Many voters who supported Donald Trump didn't care whether he ran as a Democrat or a Republican. They liked Donald Trump. They were enthusiastic about him. Something similar was true of Bernie Sanders. The fact that he identified himself as a democratic socialist really didn't make a difference to his most enthusiastic supporters. They liked Bernie Sanders. They liked the way he talked. They liked what he represented to them. So they were inspired by sort of these charismatic candidates, and that's frequently a factor in elections. Not in a lot of them. Not everybody is charismatic. But there's another group of voters that I've termed inspired who want to vote for a candidate based on a particular issue. If you think of the NRA and the Second Amendment supporters and the gun rights activists, they're going to support the candidate who's identified with those issues, even though they may not know anything about that candidate. That's also true of candidates, of voters who may be concerned about environmental issues. If they are aware that a particular candidate is supporting a green economy agenda, that's going to make them enthusiastic. They may not know anything else about that candidate, but they'll go for that candidate. And then there's a third group that nobody knows how many voters this consists of, who wake up on a Tuesday morning and realize, oh, this is election day. I'll go vote, and they have no clue as to, what the election is for, who's running, who the candidates are. Maybe they take the newspaper with them and their recommendations there on the editorial page. Maybe there's a leaflet in their door and they take that to the polling place. Maybe somebody hands them some information as they enter the polling place, or maybe they just walk into the polling booth and look at what's there and start voting for whatever reason. So these are voters that can be influenced by an organization, whether it be a party organization or a person who's outside the polling place, handing out some information saying, this is the NRA endorsed candidate. That can make a difference, but it's just happenstance with regard to this third category of voters. I think in order of influence, the controlled voters and the inspired voters are really contending for the majority of votes, and where there's no inspiration, either in terms of a charismatic candidate or a cause, an identification with the issue, the controlled vote is likely in many instances to win out.
What was the relationship of African Americans to the Democratic Party, the city Democratic Party establishment in the 1960s and 70s?
Well, it's really fascinating. During the 50s and 60s and 70s, there was an influx of black residents in cities like Philadelphia, a migration of many blacks from, in many cases, from southern cities to cities like Philadelphia, where there was still a significant industrial base. There were still jobs to be had in the manufacturing sector. And so the black population of Philadelphia, like that of Pittsburgh and other cities, grew significantly. And as the years went on, there was really a mismatch between the population of certain neighborhood areas and the elected representatives in those areas. Redistricting, the adjustment of boundaries, of district boundaries at the state legislative and congressional level takes place every 10 years after the census. And so boundaries are readjusted to try to give voters an equal representation in terms of number of voters within a particular district. As it turned out, during the 60s and 70s and afterwards, a number of legislative districts at the state level in the state house had substantial black populations, in some cases majority black populations, and were represented by white elected officials. In many cases, white elected officials who were older people who'd been there in office for some time. And so beginning really in 1970, with the election of Hardy Williams, the father of State Senator Anthony Hardy Williams. The election of Hardy Williams as a state representative in 1970 against an incumbent candidate who had been endorsed by the party it was really the catalyst for a whole series of elections that were based on the idea of better representation of black communities, which now constituted a majority or a substantial portion of the electorate in certain legislative districts. And it wasn't only about electing more black people to office. Again, in many of these districts, the incumbents were older people. I'm an older person myself. There's nothing wrong with that. But these were people that had been sitting in place for some time. And so if some voters felt that there might be an opportunity for a change, that no doubt was a factor. In Philadelphia and elsewhere, many voters do not vote along racial lines, and many black voters will vote for white candidates. when there's a black candidate in the same election. So I think something comparable was happening here. Clearly, there was a black power movement that was very ambitious, that brought out a lot of new registered voters who happened to be black, and produced a significant number of new elected officials, starting with state representatives. But I think there was also a feeling that a new breed and some new blood is going to help. And in these elections, some of the insurgent candidates who won were half the age of the incumbents. These are young men and women who were in their 20s and in some cases early 30s, who were replacing people who were in their late 60s and in 70s. So it was a very exciting time, and it produced more registered voters and a higher level of participation, which is always good.
Now, you're right about Chaka Fattah and Curtis Jones and how they worked together to conceive a strategy to win election. What was their strategy?
Well, it was really fascinating. Chaka Fattah and Curtis Jones were young men who both got acquainted through the House of Umoja, which was a West Philadelphia boys' town type resource, a place for young men who had no other options and who were either involved in street gangs or were in danger of getting involved in street gangs, a place for them to live in a supervised, safe environment and to be connected with resources for education and growth. And so these two young men were very interested in improving the political system at a time when, as I said, Hardy Williams and other activists were getting more black people involved. And these two, who were in their early 20s at the time, decided they wanted to run for office. And they didn't want to compete against each other. So they chose the office of city commissioner. And in Philadelphia, the city commissioners are three people who supervise elections, and voters in the primary election can vote for two candidates. So Curtis Jones and Chaka Fattah decided they would both file for city commissioner. That way they could both run in the same election, but it wouldn't be a zero-sum situation where one would win at the expense of the other. And there were quite a few city commissioner candidates, a dozen of them, I think, in that election. So there was a lot going on. At that time, in that year, there was also an election for mayor, which meant that there would be a higher turnout than would ordinarily be the case. One of the candidates was Charles Bowser, a black community and civic leader who had been head of the Philadelphia Urban Coalition. He had been a deputy mayor under Mayor James Tate. He was a highly respected civic and political leader. He was running for mayor in that election. And so Fattah and Jones did a clever thing. They would call Bowser's campaign every day and say, you know, we're reporters for the Temple University student newspaper. Could we get the candidate's schedule for the day? And so they got the schedule of where the candidate would be and when, and they would show up early before Bowser and present themselves as candidate for city commissioners. And they were guys who really knew how to talk it up, and they attracted attention. And it was kind of a novelty. Here are these two kids, you know, who are getting involved in politics, and they weren't just kids. They really knew their stuff. These were young men who had already held candidate forums for candidates, who had held voter registration drives. So they knew what they were talking about, and it was kind of a quirky thing, too. It was kind of a cool thing that they were up for office, and they were daring to get their names on the ballot. So they did this very successfully, and you know, after Charles Bowser would show up for his scheduled appearance, those two, Fattah and Jones, would jump on into the next event and introduce themselves there. That was very effective, and it really got them known across the city. They didn't win, but Chaka Fattah came close. He came in fourth out of a candidate of more than a dozen people, and of course he won went on to become a state representative and a state senator and then a member of Congress. And I really want to mention something about Chaka Fattah. He was a well-regarded state representative and state senator. He was an innovative member of Congress. He introduced new legislation to support education and job training and workforce development. As some of you know, he also got into trouble. He was the subject of a federal investigation. He was convicted and served time. So clearly something went wrong. And I think when people look at a career like that, they think, well, this just shows it's all worthless. Why should I participate? These people will get elected and you get excited about them, but they all turn out to be the same. I really would encourage people who have that view to sort of look at the record of individuals like Chaka Fattah, the value that he produced for Philadelphia and for other cities where education and the public school system and public housing and jobs and job readiness, getting people ready for good jobs in the new economy are important issues. Look at the contributions he made. They're very, very significant. So what about the fact that things went bad later? If more voters were involved, if more voters were engaged, if more voters were knowledgeable about the candidates, then I think there would be more opportunities to say to candidates, thank you very much for your service. It's time for somebody new. And that problems like this one could be nipped in the bud and that voters could make intelligent decisions about changes where they might be needed. And the sort of second related issue is term limits. I think everybody's aware of politicians who have been in the House and Senate, either in Harrisburg or Washington, forever. And for some of them, it's not really a good thing. In polls that have been taken of the population in general, there's a lot of support for term limits. So why aren't term limits in place at the state and federal level? Well, the answer might be that people in office that would like to stay in office don't like the idea that they'd have to leave after, say, a couple of terms. So if there were a more engaged electorate, more people participating in elections who would take on an issue like this, I think you start to see elected officials change their mind about term limits and maybe get religion about this, and we'd have term limits in place. So I think that's really, regardless of how you feel about politics and politicians, one way to cure corruption in politics is by establishing term limits for everybody, so that they don't have an opportunity to extend their careers indefinitely and to take advantage of the political benefits associated with that.
Now, you also write about judicial elections, and one in particular that was unusual, where you had 10 open judicial seats and a group of candidates who became known as the KC5. Who were they?
Well, it was an interesting situation that took place during the mid-1980s in which 10 judges in Common Pleas Court were suspended for having taken money from the roofers union. And if you just take a deep breath and think of that, 10 people who took an oath to serve on the bench, taking money from a union, what was going on there? What does that say about the system? What was encouraging about that situation was that Governor Casey at the time really, to me, did the right thing. He appointed a panel to recommend to him 10 candidates to fill those vacant seats, and supported those candidates in the elections that year to fill those seats and really address a very significant backlog of cases that had built up in Common Pleas Court. And so 10 candidates were recommended by this advisory panel, and the governor endorsed them. You don't hear about that happening these days. And I think that's something that we should want future governors to think about doing. What happened in this particular time was that the governor supported the panel recommendations without consulting Democratic City Committee, which in the 1980s, was a formidable force and wanted to have a say in who the next judges would be to fill these 10 vacant seats. As it happened, 5 of the candidates had some affiliations with the party. In some cases, a young lawyer who would be interested in running for judge in the future will help out the party organization. There's nothing wrong with that. They'll help out a candidate with filing nominating petitions. They'll help the party with a particular litigation that's going on. So there's nothing bad about that. And it's a way for an ambitious young attorney to get recognized by the party and maybe endorsed by the party in a future election. That's one sort of pathway to success, to be available on a pro bono basis to assist the party. And so 5 of these nominees of Governor Casey's had some kind of affiliation with the Democratic Party or, in 2 cases, the Republican Party organization. And those 5 candidates were endorsed by the party organizations and were supported by those organizations for the upcoming primary election. 5 of them were not, and they included people like LaGrome Davis, who was head of the rape unit in the district attorney's office and would have been prohibited from participating in political activity. So there was no connection between LaGrome Davis, a prosecutor, and the Democratic City Committee. Another candidate was Darnell Jones, who worked for the Public Defender's Office, which is the organization in Philadelphia that provides free legal representation for individuals that can't afford legal counsel. Again, public defenders can't get involved in politics. They can't create ties with a party organization. Rather than recognizing this and looking at the qualifications of people like Darnell Jones and LaGrome Davis, the party organization refused to endorse these 5 individuals and instead endorsed other candidates in the upcoming primary election. So this was kind of devastating for one of them, like Darnell Jones, who was delighted to have been one of the governor's picks, but had to resign as a public defender because he could not be a candidate in an upcoming election. So he resigned, but then later found that the party wasn't going to support him. So he was really left up in the air, left in limbo, and very concerned that he was out of a job and was not going to be elected. Fortunately, these candidates all received support from the media. The governor got allied with some business leaders who were concerned about integrity in the judicial system. Darnell Jones was a member of the congregation of Zion Baptist Church, the pastor of which was the Reverend Leon Sullivan, a internationally known figure at the time, and Zion Baptist Church had thousands of congregants who were aware that Darnell Jones was a member. Obviously, the church couldn't promote him as a candidate, but they could recognize him as an individual who was participating in the upcoming election. So clearly that combination of factors made a difference. And fortunately, the KC5, as they became known, all won the office of Common Pleas Judge. Darnell Jones is now a respected judge in the federal court system. LaGrome Davis also went on from Common Pleas Court to the U.S. District Court. He retired recently, again, a respected member of the judiciary. So I think this experience really sort of should influence people to think about how we're choosing judges at the local level. And unfortunately, party endorsements still matter a great deal in Philadelphia, as they do in other cities. And so finding a way, either through the Bar Association or through business leadership, to support candidates who may or may not be endorsed by the party organization to win office, I think is really important. Clearly, some endorsed candidates are outstanding prospects for the judiciary. Some of them may not be. And a complicating factor in Philadelphia, it may be this way elsewhere, is that ballot positions are chosen by a drawing of ballot numbers. And in many instances, there are over a dozen candidates possibly running for half a dozen positions on the judiciary. And so those candidates appear on the ballot in a number of columns. Each column might have 4 or 5, 6 names in them, and there might be 3 or 4 or 5 candidates. And so before the ballots are drawn up, for common pleas court, and this is still happening. The ballot numbers are put into a coffee can. This is the truth. This is not a joke. And the candidates or their representatives choose numbers from the coffee can without looking, and the number that they pick determines their position on the ballot. And so if you can picture this ballot for common pleas court, several columns of candidates. You don't know anything about any of the candidates, and the first name that you see is at the top of the left-hand column. Many voters are going to be inclined to vote for that person. If a candidate happens to be in the 4th column to the right and is second to the last or last in that column, chances are reasonably good that a lot of voters aren't going to vote for that candidate. And in an election where, a large number of voters can't tell one judge from another, and have no guidance about, who was deemed qualified by the Bar Association, who was deemed not qualified. They may just go down that first column and click off the names of the first candidates that appear there, and that may or may not be a good thing. There have been some poor candidates, poorly qualified candidates, who were not recommended by the Bar Association, who have been winners because they appeared in that first column. So again, there are always problems with a nominating panel and with a governor-supported slate of candidates. But couldn't we do better than this? I hope the chapter in my book that describes the KC5 situation will encourage more people, wherever they live, to think about how the judiciary is selected, and something is going on that's comparable to what has happened here. There may be value in looking into opportunities for change.
We are out of time. We've been speaking with John Kromer. He is the author of Philadelphia Battlefields, Disruptive Campaigns and Upset Elections in a Changing City. Thank you for joining me.
Great. Thanks very much. Glad to be here.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details.